The studio was buzzing with anticipation, the lights dimming as the host introduced two of the most powerful men in the world, Elon Musk and Donald Trump. The tension in the air was palpable. People were gathered around their screens, some waiting eagerly for the latest tech updates from Musk, while others were tuning in to hear what Trump, the former president, had to say about the current political landscape. But no one expected what was coming next. As the camera zoomed in, both men sat across from the host, their faces calm but their eyes sharp, as if they were about to reveal something that would change everything. The host looked directly into the camera, his voice steady but filled with excitement. "Tonight, we have a special program," he began, his tone setting the stage. "We're joined by two men who need no introduction. But what they're about to share with us will shock you. Elon Musk, the CEO of SpaceX and Tesla, and Donald Trump, the 45th President of the United States, are here to reveal the shocking truth about government funding cuts and their plan to weed out corruption. You won't want to miss this." Elon Musk adjusted his seat, his usual confident demeanor overshadowed by a rare, serious expression. He turned to Trump, then back at the host. "I'm sure the world's been waiting to hear about this," Musk said, his voice low but steady. "But let's just say that what we're about to reveal isn't something that only affects politicians. It affects every single one of us. The truth about where our money goes, who's been pocketing it, and how the system has been rigged for far too long." Trump nodded, his face stern. "I've spent my entire life fighting corruption. And what we found, it's worse than anything you could imagine. We've been lied to, manipulated, and kept in the dark. But it's time to pull back the curtain. The American people deserve the truth, and we're here to give it to them." The host's expression turned serious as he leaned forward, sensing the gravity of the moment. "So, you're saying this isn't just about cutting funding, it's about exposing a deeper, systemic problem?" "Exactly," Musk replied. "This isn't just about money, it's about accountability, about cleaning up a system that's been feeding off the people for decades. We're talking about uncovering the corruption at the highest levels. And we're not just talking about Washington, it's everywhere." Trump's gaze was intense, his words cutting through the tension in the room. "There are people who've been stealing from the taxpayers, hiding funds, and using the system to their advantage. They've been doing it for years, and it's time for it to stop." The camera zoomed in on Musk and Trump, their faces filled with determination. For the first time in a long while, the audience could sense the sincerity in their voices. This wasn't a political move. This wasn't a power play. It was something much bigger. The host, still stunned by the boldness of their statements, managed to ask, "What's next? How do you plan to cut through all the red tape and actually make these changes happen?" Trump leaned back in his chair, a slight smirk crossing his face. "You don't need to ask me, you need to ask them. The ones who've been feeding off the system for too long. But we're not stopping. We have the power, and now we have the truth. It's time to expose it all," Musk added. "And once we expose it, we can rebuild. We'll cut the waste, the corruption, and put the money where it truly belongs, back in the hands of the people." With a final, piercing look, both men turned their attention to the camera, as if speaking directly to the millions watching at home. "Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from," Musk said, his tone now a little lighter. "This story might just spark a new beginning." Trump's voice was stern but filled with resolve. "What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? For us, it's knowing that we're fighting for something bigger than ourselves. Stay tuned, because the truth is coming." As the camera cut to commercial, the audience was left in stunned silence, the weight of their words hanging heavily in the air. What had started as a typical political talk show was quickly turning into something far more significant. The world was about to change, and it was clear. No one would be left unaffected. The story of how Elon Musk and Donald Trump came together to expose the corruption within the U.S. government didn't start in the flashy world of headlines or on the set of a national talk show. It began much earlier, in moments of frustration, realization, and an unshakable desire for change. Elon Musk had always been a man of vision. The moment he founded Zip2, he began his journey of challenging the status quo. His focus shifted quickly to electric vehicles, space exploration, and artificial intelligence, all areas where he knew the world could do better. But what people didn't always see was the struggle behind the scenes. For every successful venture, Musk had faced incredible opposition. Whether it was critics doubting the potential of Tesla's electric cars or skeptics questioning the feasibility of colonizing Mars, Musk had always faced a constant battle against an entrenched system that seemed content with the status quo. For years, he had worked tirelessly, breaking barriers and pushing forward. Yet, despite his successes, Musk had witnessed firsthand how inefficiency and corruption held back innovation in the systems he hoped to improve. His companies had been caught in bureaucratic red tape. Government grants and tax incentives were funneled into areas that didn't align with his mission to revolutionize industries. It became clear to him that the very system that was supposed to foster innovation was being hijacked by corrupt individuals more interested in personal gain than in serving the public. Then there was Donald Trump. To say Trump's life had been full of controversies would be an understatement. But behind the headlines and the often polarizing rhetoric, there was a man who had spent decades battling in the business world and, later, in the political arena. Trump's career had been marked by his own brand of fighting against the system. From real estate deals to his time in the White House, Trump had always been at odds with the establishment. As president, Trump's time in office had been one of fierce opposition from the political class, with accusations of corruption, Russian meddling, and scandals swirling around every corner. But Trump's drive to drain the swamp had always been at the forefront of his agenda. While many questioned the way he went about it, Trump never backed down from his belief that the U.S. government was fundamentally broken and the system was rigged against the American people. It was after leaving office, with time to reflect, that Trump began to feel a growing sense of urgency. The more he read about the state of the government, the more he realized that the problems ran deeper than anyone could imagine. There were entire networks of individuals embedded within the system, politicians, bureaucrats, lobbyists, who were using their power to line their pockets at the expense of the American people. But where did Musk come into the picture? Their paths had crossed in the past, but it wasn't until Musk reached out to Trump after a high-profile speech in Washington that the two men began to discuss their frustrations with the government. Musk had always admired Trump's resilience, even if he didn't agree with all his methods. Trump, in turn, saw in Musk someone who wasn't afraid to take on powerful institutions and break them apart to build something new. Both of them knew that they were two outsiders, men who weren't afraid to get their hands dirty to make things right. Over a series of private meetings, Musk and Trump began to realize how much they had in common. They both believed that America's political system had become too corrupted, and that the only way to fix it was to remove the people who had been exploiting it for their own benefit. It was during one of these conversations that they came up with the idea of tackling the government's funding structure. Musk's history with government funding had been complicated. While he had benefited from government subsidies and contracts for Tesla and SpaceX, he had seen how easily those same funds could be misused or siphoned off into the wrong pockets. For years, he had argued that the system of government funding wasn't working. And in Trump, he found a powerful ally, someone who could help expose the true extent of the corruption. Trump, for his part, knew exactly how deep the problem ran. His presidency had been marred by constant clashes with Congress and accusations of obstruction. He had come to the conclusion that the real issue wasn't just political gridlock. It was the pervasive corruption that kept politicians more interested in their own interests than in the well-being of the people they swore to serve. Their first real breakthrough came when Musk and Trump began digging into the various government programs that were meant to fund innovation, infrastructure, and public services. They uncovered shocking revelations. Programs meant to help the disadvantaged were being misappropriated. Large amounts of taxpayer money were being funneled into ineffective projects or worse, straight into the pockets of those with the right connections. Government contracts were awarded not based on merit but on favoritism, and those in power seemed to have no intention of cleaning up the mess. Musk felt betrayed by the system he had once believed in. He had spent years trying to push his ideas forward, only to be met with roadblocks built by the very people who were supposed to support innovation. Trump, too, felt the sting of disillusionment. Despite all his efforts to challenge the system during his time as president, the corruption had remained. It was clear now, the status quo had to change, but they both knew that to succeed, they would need more than just their own influence. They needed to mobilize the American people, to show them the true extent of what was going on behind the scenes. That's when they decided to join forces publicly, to take their fight to the people and expose the rot within the system. And what better way to do it than through the media, where Musk and Trump both had significant platforms. In their first joint appearance, Musk and Trump planned to unveil a shocking truth that would stir the country. Not only were they cutting funding to the programs that were perpetuating corruption, but they also had plans to uncover the identities of those benefiting from the system. It was going to be a fight, and they were ready for it. But as they sat in that studio, preparing for the live broadcast, neither Musk nor Trump knew just how deep the rabbit hole went. Their journey was about to take them into places they never imagined, where power, money, and corruption intersected in ways that would shake the very foundations of the government. The moment the live broadcast ended, Musk and Trump felt the weight of what they had just set in motion. They had dropped a bombshell, and the entire world was watching. But with that attention came fierce opposition. The political establishment, corporate elites, and powerful lobbyists were already preparing their counterattack. They knew that exposing corruption in such a blatant manner would not go unnoticed, and the stakes had just gotten a whole lot higher. The fallout was immediate. Within hours of the broadcast, Musk's social media feeds exploded. His supporters, many of whom had followed him for years due to his visionary work in technology and space, rallied behind his bold stance. But there were just as many, if not more, critics who accused him of overstepping, of playing politics in a world where he didn't belong. Stick to rockets and electric cars, they said. Leave the government to the politicians. But Musk had already made up his mind. The issue at hand was too important to ignore. On the other hand, Trump's phone was ringing off the hook. His loyal base, which had rallied behind him during his presidential run, was equally divided. Some saw this as a fresh fight against the deep state, a continuation of the battles Trump had started in the White House. Others, however, were skeptical. What's really behind this? Is this just another publicity stunt? They wondered. The skepticism within his own ranks was almost as troubling as the external attacks. Meanwhile, the media buzzed with speculation. News outlets, both conservative and liberal, began to weigh in. On one side, some hailed Musk and Trump as the new saviors of American democracy. On the other, pundits condemned their actions as reckless, warning that their interference could destabilize the delicate balance of power in Washington. Politicians from both sides of the aisle, many of whom had long benefited from the corrupted system Musk and Trump were exposing, started to push back. They called the revelations hyperbole and accused Musk and Trump of creating unnecessary chaos. But it wasn't just the media or the political elite that was fighting back. Behind the scenes, the web of corruption Musk and Trump had exposed was already putting up its defenses. Powerful figures within the government and private sector, those who had long controlled the flow of funding and resources, were working quietly to discredit them, to tear down their reputations, and to squash any momentum they might have gained. Musk, however, wasn't one to back down. The more the media attacked him, the more determined he became to uncover the truth. His team began working overtime, compiling evidence, reaching out to whistleblowers, and finding new ways to bypass the system and get the truth directly into the hands of the American people. Every time a new piece of corruption was unearthed, Musk would make it public. The pressure began to mount, and as Musk's social media presence grew, so did his influence. More and more people began to rally behind him. Citizens, activists, and even some politicians who had grown tired of the corruption. But the real turning point came when Musk and Trump were able to secure a key ally, a former government insider who had worked closely with the agencies in charge of the funding programs. This whistleblower, who went by the name of Agent X, had information that would send shockwaves through the entire system. He had worked within the Department of Defense and other federal agencies, watching as funds intended for public projects were redirected to private companies with ties to powerful individuals. Agent X revealed that this was not an isolated incident, but a systemic issue that had been going on for decades. The whistleblower's revelations confirmed Musk and Trump's worst suspicions. It wasn't just inefficiency or bureaucracy at play. It was calculated corruption. Contracts were being awarded to companies with little to no accountability, and taxpayers' money was being squandered on unnecessary projects that only served to line the pockets of a few wealthy elites. Worse, the corruption ran so deep that those involved had already made efforts to erase any trace of wrongdoing, making it nearly impossible to trace the stolen funds. But as powerful as the evidence was, Agent X's decision to go public with the information came with a price. The whistleblower's life was now at risk. Musk and Trump both knew that revealing Agent X's identity would likely put him in danger, but they also understood that the truth was more important than personal safety. The conflict was escalating, and tensions were rising to a boiling point. As the revelations continued to spread, the mainstream media began to take notice. The New York Times, CNN, Fox News, everyone had to cover the story. But it wasn't just the news outlets that were buzzing. The government was scrambling to respond, issuing denials, and calling for investigations into the claims. Some officials even went so far as to accuse Musk and Trump of spreading disinformation, trying to undermine the very foundation of the federal government. In the midst of this chaos, Musk began to feel the weight of his own decisions. He had been used to making bold moves in business, but this was different. This wasn't just about building rockets or cars. This was about dismantling an entire system, a system that had been in place for decades. He had no idea how far the corruption ran or how much power those he was up against truly wielded. The more they fought back, the more Musk and Trump began to realize that their battle wasn't just against corruption. It was against an entrenched system that had been operating in the shadows for years. Trump, for his part, saw the stakes clearly. This was more than just a political fight. It was about saving the country he loved. It was about protecting the future of America and ensuring that the next generation would have a chance to live in a society that was just and fair. But he knew that to win this battle, they would need to be prepared for a war. Not just in the media, but in the courts, the halls of Congress, and perhaps even in the streets. With the stakes rising and the opposition intensifying, Musk and Trump were about to face the hardest challenge of their lives, to fight back against an entire system built on secrecy and lies. But they weren't backing down. Not now, not ever. The stage was set for what could be the most significant battle of their careers. The battle was no longer just about exposing corruption. It had become a journey of survival, a race against time to unearth the truth before those in power buried it forever. Musk and Trump, now the faces of a growing movement, found themselves on the front lines of an ideological war. The world watched as they took the fight directly to the heart of Washington, D.C., with every move scrutinized, every word dissected. Their alliance, once a curious pairing of two giants from different worlds, had now evolved into a powerhouse of resistance. The media, polarized as ever, had turned their focus to the two men. One day they were heroes, the next day they were villains. The stakes were no longer just about public perception. It was about life and death, of reputations, careers, and the future of the nation. The first significant turning point came when Musk and Trump managed to secure a high-profile meeting with a select group of bipartisan senators. They had grown increasingly desperate to get their message out, to prove that their fight was not about politics but about protecting the very soul of the nation from corruption. The meeting was set in one of the most secure Senate chambers, a place where decisions that shaped the future of the country had been made for over 2 centuries. The room was tense. Musk sat, his usual calm demeanor overshadowed by the gravity of the situation. Trump, ever the fighter, sat beside him, the quiet murmur of his past political battles clearly visible in his eyes. Their challenge was no longer simply to expose corruption. It was now about convincing those who held the power to take action, to stand up to their own colleagues, many of whom were part of the system they were trying to dismantle. We're not just talking about the failure of a few programs, Musk began, his voice calm yet resolute. We're talking about systemic corruption, billions of dollars, taxpayer money, being misappropriated by people in positions of power, and it's been happening for years. Trump leaned forward, his eyes locking with the senators across the table. This isn't about left or right. This is about saving America from a government that's been hijacked by the very people who should be working for us. It's time to weed out the rot. The senators were visibly uncomfortable. Some were skeptical, others seemed intrigued, but none were ready to make a commitment. The conversation swirled around familiar talking points: concerns about the fallout, the risk of alienating powerful donors, and the potential damage to their own careers. But Musk and Trump weren't backing down. They presented irrefutable evidence: records of misallocated funds, personal accounts from insiders who had come forward, and whistleblower testimonies that painted a damning picture of corruption at the highest levels. For the first time, the senators were beginning to understand the depth of what Musk and Trump were saying. But understanding wasn't enough. Action was required, and that was where the real challenge lay. Many of the senators had been part of the very system Musk and Trump were attempting to dismantle. They were too entrenched in the political web to take a stand without fear of consequences. At that moment, Trump spoke again, his tone fierce and unwavering. If you don't act now, the American people will see this for what it is, a failure of leadership. A failure to protect the very institutions that make this country great. The tension in the room was palpable. This was the point of no return. Musk and Trump had laid it all on the line. If the senators didn't act, their movement would lose credibility. They would become just another flash in the pan of political spectacle. But if the senators chose to fight, it would ignite a nationwide revolution, a movement that could reshape the way America's government worked, forever. The meeting ended in stalemate, but it wasn't a loss. Musk and Trump had planted the seeds of doubt. The whispers had begun to spread. Within hours, the news outlets began to report the meeting, the senators' reluctance, and the mounting pressure to reform. Their message had begun to take root, not just in the Senate, but across the country. Over the next few weeks, the tension grew. Musk's team continued to unearth more evidence, pushing the narrative forward. Every day brought new revelations. But with each step closer to the truth, the forces of opposition grew stronger. Musk and Trump were increasingly targeted by those who stood to lose the most. The entrenched elites who controlled the money, the media, and the levers of power. Then came the surprise. A bombshell report surfaced, confirming that one of the most powerful figures in Washington had been involved in a massive cover-up. This individual, a longtime ally of both political parties, had orchestrated the diversion of millions of dollars of government funds to companies with personal connections to their family members and business partners. This wasn't just the kind of corruption Musk and Trump had suspected. It was much, much worse. The report hit the headlines like an atomic bomb. The public's outrage was immediate and intense. Protests erupted in major cities. People were marching in the streets, demanding justice. The senators who had once hesitated now faced mounting pressure to act. The calls for reform were deafening. Musk and Trump had finally found the tipping point. But as the public outcry grew, so did the stakes. Powerful forces within the government began working overtime to discredit Musk and Trump. They were branded as troublemakers, as people who were trying to tear apart the fabric of American democracy. The media, ever divided, continued to stoke the flames of division. Some outlets praised their bravery, while others condemned them as reckless. Musk and Trump were now caught in the eye of a storm. There was no going back. The truth was out, but exposing it had brought them to the very edge of everything they had fought for. As they navigated this chaotic landscape, they both knew that this was just the beginning. The real fight was still ahead. The day after the bombshell report went public, the nation was divided like never before. The outrage was palpable. The air was thick with tension, and yet, amid the chaos, Musk and Trump felt a strange calm. They had fought for the truth, and now the truth was out. But that didn't make the storm any easier to weather. It was during this storm that the unthinkable happened. Musk's company, SpaceX, which had become synonymous with the future of space exploration, found itself under siege. A group of powerful lawmakers, tied to the very corruption Musk and Trump had exposed, initiated an investigation into SpaceX. It wasn't just a typical inquiry. It was a full-blown witch hunt. The attack was swift and brutal. Media outlets began to question Musk's motives, linking his ambitious space project to the very corruption he had condemned. The narrative twisted. Was Musk just another billionaire, trying to use his wealth and influence to push a personal agenda? Or was he genuinely fighting for the greater good? Trump, always the fighter, had his own battles to contend with. His political career had been built on challenging the establishment, but now, he was faced with the same accusations that had once been leveled against him during his presidency. They were accusing him of using the system for personal gain. His every move, every tweet, and every public statement were being scrutinized. The same media that had once championed him now had him in their sights, determined to take him down once and for all. It was clear. Musk and Trump were being painted as the villains in a story they had set in motion. But something unexpected was brewing, a shift in public perception. The people, the everyday citizens who had watched this drama unfold from the sidelines, began to rise up. The tipping point came during a live broadcast of a town hall meeting in New York. Musk and Trump had been invited to speak to a large crowd of citizens, many of whom had lost faith in the system. These people weren't politicians or elites. They were the working class, the people who felt the weight of corruption on their shoulders every day. The crowd had come with open minds, but also with skepticism. Could these two men really be the champions of change, or were they just another set of actors playing a role for their own benefit? Musk took the stage first. As he began to speak, the tension in the room was palpable. "I know that many of you are questioning my motives right now. I get it," he said, his voice steady but carrying an emotional weight that wasn't there before. "I didn't get into this to make more money. I didn't start Tesla, SpaceX, or Neuralink for personal gain. I started these companies because I believe in the future. And the future is under threat by a corrupt system that only serves those in power." The room was quiet. Musk's words were more than just rhetoric. They were a confession, an admission of vulnerability. He wasn't just a billionaire entrepreneur. He was a man who had seen firsthand how deep the corruption ran, and it was clear that this battle was taking a personal toll on him. Trump stepped up next. His face was hard, but there was a vulnerability in his voice as he began to speak. "I've spent my entire life fighting against the system. I've fought for what I believe is right, and I've paid the price. I've been mocked, ridiculed, and discredited, but I've never wavered. And now, I'm here to tell you, this fight is bigger than me. It's bigger than Elon. It's bigger than any of us. This is about our country, about our future. We can't let the corruption win." For the first time in a long while, the crowd didn't react with anger or skepticism. Instead, they listened. They felt the weight of the moment. These were two men who had risen to the top of their respective fields and fought against the very forces that had sought to control them. They weren't just fighting for power. They were fighting for a cause bigger than themselves. As the meeting went on, the truth became undeniable. Musk and Trump weren't simply reacting to the pressure. They were pushing back against it with every ounce of their being. But the emotional toll was starting to show. The sacrifices they had made, relationships strained, reputations on the line, were beginning to weigh heavily on them. Later that evening, as the broadcast ended, Musk sat alone in his office, staring out at the stars. He had spent his life looking to the future, always thinking about what could be. But now, everything felt different. The fight for the truth had brought him here, but at what cost? He had become a symbol of resistance, but he was also isolated, more alone than ever. Trump, too, felt the strain. As he walked back to his private residence, he couldn't help but reflect on the toll this battle had taken on him. He had never been afraid of conflict, but the personal sacrifices were starting to pile up. Family, friends, allies, they were all being tested. And he knew, deep down, that things would never be the same. As the night wore on, Musk and Trump both received a call that would change everything. It was Agent X, the whistleblower who had risked everything to come forward with the truth. He had uncovered something even bigger, a document, a trail of evidence that could bring down the entire network of corruption they had been fighting. It was the smoking gun. But there was a catch. The document was locked behind a firewall that only the most powerful figures in the government could access. Getting it out would be nearly impossible. Musk knew that this could be their last chance to expose the entire system, but it would come with a price. The more they pushed, the more they risked. The stakes were higher than ever, and there was no turning back. The emotional climax had arrived. The question now was whether Musk and Trump could rise to the challenge and take down the corrupt system once and for all, or whether they would be swallowed by it. The next few days were a blur of meetings, late-night strategy sessions, and countless phone calls. Musk and Trump had just received the key to bringing the corrupt system to its knees, a classified document that could expose the entire network of high-profile individuals profiting from the systemic corruption. But the cost of retrieving and releasing the information was immense. If they were caught, they would lose everything. Their businesses, their reputations, even their freedom. It was a gamble. The stakes couldn't be higher. As the pressure mounted, the two men wrestled with their own fears and doubts. They had come so far, but was it enough? Was it worth the personal sacrifices they had already made? The journey had taken them to places they never imagined, challenging their values, their beliefs, and their futures. In the quiet of his office, Musk sat with the document in his hands. The weight of it seemed too much to bear. He had spent his life innovating, dreaming about a better future, but this wasn't the future he had envisioned. This was a battle for survival, not just for his companies, but for the very soul of the country he loved. He thought about the families whose futures had been stolen by the corruption he had uncovered. He thought about the whistleblowers who had risked their lives to bring the truth to light. And he thought about the millions of Americans who had trusted him to be a force for change. Could he live with himself if he didn't act? The answer was clear. He called Trump. "It's time," Musk said simply. "We have to do it. We can't back down now." Trump, who had been pacing the halls of his residence, didn't hesitate. "I've always said that the greatest risk is not taking a risk at all. We're already in too deep, Elon. We're going to do this, no matter what happens next." The two men knew that releasing the document would be their final act in this battle. Once it was out, there would be no going back. The system they had been trying to take down would retaliate with everything it had: lawsuits, smear campaigns, and perhaps even physical threats. But the document was their ticket to victory. It was their chance to expose the rot at the heart of Washington, D.C., the corporate elites, the government officials who had been siphoning billions of dollars from the American people. If they could get it into the right hands, into the hands of the public, they could ignite a revolution. The decision was made. They would release the document, and the world would see the truth. The fallout. When the document was finally made public, the world reacted with shock and disbelief. The sheer scale of the corruption was staggering. The names of powerful senators, CEOs, and business tycoons were all revealed, each one connected to a web of illegal activities, bribery, and embezzlement. The American public was stunned. Protests erupted in the streets. People who had been fed up with the system for years now had the proof they needed to demand change. The government, which had been so entrenched in corruption, was left scrambling to contain the damage. The elite class, who had long considered themselves untouchable, now faced a reckoning. As the fallout spread across the nation, Musk and Trump stood on opposite sides of the battle. They were no longer the faces of a conspiracy. They were the faces of a movement. People rallied behind them, not because they were perfect, but because they were willing to take risks that others wouldn't. They were willing to fight when others had backed down. The media, once split in their coverage of Musk and Trump, now found themselves in a delicate position. The truth was out, and the public was demanding accountability. While some outlets continued to vilify them, others had no choice but to report on the revelations. The tide of public opinion had shifted, but for Musk and Trump, the fight wasn't over. Exposing the corruption was just the first step. The real challenge was what came next: how to rebuild the system, how to ensure that the power of the people was restored, and how to keep the corrupt from regaining control. Reflection and change. In the weeks that followed, Musk and Trump found themselves facing a new challenge: healing a divided nation. While many celebrated the downfall of the corrupt elite, there were those who felt betrayed. The revelations had shaken the foundation of American democracy. Trust in the government was at an all-time low, and the road to recovery seemed uncertain. For Musk, the journey had been one of personal growth. He had learned the true meaning of sacrifice, the price of standing up for what's right, and the heavy burden of leadership. He had always been driven by a desire to push the boundaries of what was possible, but now he realized that true leadership wasn't just about innovation. It was about standing firm in the face of adversity and fighting for a better future, even when it seemed impossible. Trump, too, had been transformed by the experience. He had always been a fighter, but now he understood the true cost of that fight. It wasn't about winning elections or gaining power. It was about using that power to make a real difference. The political game had changed, and Trump knew that if he wanted to leave a lasting legacy, it couldn't just be about defeating his enemies. It had to be about building something better for the next generation. The road ahead was long, but the two men were no longer fighting alone. The people, galvanized by the revelations, began to organize. Grassroots movements sprouted across the country. Citizens took to the streets, demanding reform, transparency, and accountability. The call for change had never been louder. As the country began to rebuild, Musk and Trump stood side by side. They knew the battle wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, they felt a sense of hope. The corruption had been exposed, but now they had the chance to create something new, a system that was truly for the people, by the people. And in that moment, they understood something profound. The true power of a movement wasn't in the hands of the powerful few. It was in the hands of the many. The people had spoken, and they had made their voices heard.